this is the RPG Crawler, and welcome to another RPG Storytime. Rather than talk about one particular group or event, or one particular theme, this time I'm going to single out one particular dungeon that I designed. Now, I've been playing D&D and RPGs in general since the mid-'80s, since I was very young. And a lot of that time was spent being the dungeon master, being the person that runs things. And as such, I've designed well over my share of adventures in dungeons. A couple of them I've designed so that I can plug them into different campaigns just as they are or with a few adjustments. And this kind of actually is a strategy I recommend to DMs, especially if you're going to be a long-term DM. It's design at least a few generic dungeons that you can go ahead and just pop in either as optional dungeons or whatever. But anyway, this particular dungeon is the worst dungeon ever. Not the worst designed dungeon ever, no. It is the dungeon which I explicitly designed to be particularly unpleasant. It's the dungeon that when I asked my players that have gone through it, or at least looked into it, they said they've had fun. They said it was challenging, but they said they don't want to do it again ever. So it's an interesting thing. Now, I created it for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition. This was actually one of the first 4 dungeons I ever made, although I made it well in advance before I knew that my players could handle it. And now I've been able to run it in AD&D 2nd edition, in BECME era D&D, and in 3.5. I never converted it to 4th edition, but I am working on a version for 5th edition, and the only reason I haven't really fully converted it to 5th edition is because, quite frankly, I don't have a campaign running right now where I could put it. But I do intend to convert it. Now, I call it The Hole. Sort of like the old Payneal back in EverQuest, although I named this dungeon way before playing that game. Even way back when. This was years before EverQuest came out. This dungeon has a different origin, although if you've actually played the original EverQuest and gone to the Hole, it's probably going to feel that level of annoyance as you go through it. So you may see some parallels here. Now, although I've created it and included it in quite a few campaigns and various editions, it's actually rarely been visited for reasons that will become clear. Probably because there is a certain risk versus reward associated with it, and I never put it as a required dungeon. It's always been optional. I'm not even sure what it's best used for. I designed it originally as sort of a joke, but it proved so effective that I've used it for class-specific quests, especially regarding weaponry, such as a paladin's holy sword or something similar. Something to draw characters in that they could do without, so they could skip the whole thing, but is just tempting enough to reach out and really interest them. So the basic premise of the whole thing, the fundamental premise, is to flip the idea of this heroic epic fantasy on its head and just come up with the most ignoble, the most just annoying thing that you could design a dungeon for. Now, I took a look at some of the things that I personally despise playing in or facing in various RPGs and kind of mishmash them all into one collection of just, no, I don't want to do that. Is it going to be fun for the players? As I said, some of them said they had fun, but they wouldn't want to do it again. And I've had a number that just heard the idea of this dungeon in character and decided, just to nope out. They didn't even want to do it. But all of the ones that went through said, yes, it was actually pretty challenging to go through. And some of my groups are skill players. They play to show how skilled they are at a particular system or at role-playing in general. And those are the kinds of people that really enjoyed this one. So what elements do you put into a dungeon to make it just supremely unpleasant? What sorts of dungeons do people not like? Well, the most obvious choice is some sort of sewer level. They're cramped, they're smelly, they're full of disease. Most of the enemies are going to be vermin, which are notoriously lax on treasure. They've often got boring, repetitive layouts. But let's face it, most sewers are found under cities. In fact, unless it's an abandoned sewer in a ruin, all sewers are going to be found under cities. And that means that they're near to civilization, so they're easy to hop into and out of for replenishment. And if you're going to design something that's unpleasant, you actually want to limit that to make it so the characters are encouraged to go through it either all at once or to limit their exposure to the thing. But there is another sort of dungeon that's very similar to a sewer level, but one that you can place anywhere, and one which I have stated that I hate as much as sewer levels in the past, if you've been watching my videos for a while. And that is the idea of a bug's nest or a bug tunnel. So you can take the principal idea of some sort of bug tunnel and then just move it way the hell out there out of civilization, and you've got the smelly, disease and poisonous-ridden, area with boring, repetitive layouts that is, by its nature, full of vermin. So you can take that and you can move it way the hell away from the city. So what sort of terrain do I move it to? Because this usually gets overlooked in a lot of dungeon designs, but the trip to the dungeon can be it can require at least as much preparation as the trip into the dungeon. So what kind of terrain do I move it to? I usually put it into some sort of swamp. Swamps are one of those terrible terrains that are difficult to navigate. They have more food and water available than a desert, but they often that food and water sources are stagnant or poisonous or disease-ridden, which is sometimes harder to deal with than just conjuring food or water. A swamp is much more closed in. It's got limited visibility, thus boosting the difficulty of random encounters and shortening the encounter range incredibly. Just trying to get to the bug nest in question, you've got encounters that are ambush encounters like crocodiles and alligators, encounters that are riddled with poisonous creatures like snakes. You got the stagnant water and bugs that can make for exposure to various diseases, so characters can actually catch something on the way to the dungeon, and it just makes it that much more unpleasant. Furthermore, because of the variety of swamps, you can actually include the same sorts of weather effects that you might see in a desert. You can say, oh, this swamp is in an incredibly humid, hot area. It may not be like dehydration level, but it can still cause exhaustion and fatigue even before you get to the dungeon. So right off the bat, you're looking at a bug nest dungeon that's miles from civilization, probably going to require a hex crawl type wilderness exploration just to get there. In fact, the characters may have heard what general direction it is or what general area it is, but they're probably not going to have a map direct to it, so they may have to explore in this fetid, hot, humid swamp for a couple of days. So that's a great start, right? I mean, right there, you've already really put the party into some misery. So now you've got the dungeon type itself. A bug's nest in a terrain type location, a distant swamp. So you've already got laid out for you the enemy theme, which is going to be bugs or vermin and similar creatures. Now, according to the most basic principles of adventure design, you should have some sort of background story. For the whole, the thing that sets it apart from just a normal bug nest is a very, very simple premise. I go once, some time ago, possibly very long time ago, a meteor of some sort fell from the sky and fell into the swamp. And later, as it was sitting there, weighing down and sinking into the ground, it later opened up into a sinkhole, either from its direct impact or it might have been years later, and a sinkhole opens up underneath it, dropping it into this cavern below. And then at some later date, You got bugs that started nesting there, maybe being affected by the meteor, maybe being affected by the magic or whatever. So that gives you a nice background that not only describes the origin but also the general shape of the dungeon. So you're going to have like a crater and then a drop off with a big cavern and probably a nest of some sort in the middle, and you're probably going to have like tunnels through the outside of the cavern. Now sometimes I add a step that some poor misguided cult or something also built some sort of temple structure at the bottom to commemorate the fall of the meteorite, depending on how complex I want to get. It's a good touch. It's a nice touch. The temple doesn't have to be overly complex itself because it's situated at the bottom of this miserable place. So it does give a nice excuse to have either a fully forged weapon if it's got a temple or some item of importance down at the bottom. You know, if it's just the nest itself, or even the temple might even store this, it may just be a remnant of the original meteor that can be used to craft such a weapon. So, the party may go there, pick it up, and then have to get it back to town to make the weapon. So, take that as you will. Now, the exact form of the hole has varied from game to game that I've run it in, because I add things, I change things, etc. But generally speaking, once you get past the swamps, as I said, you find a shallow crater with a sinkhole in the middle. And the crater itself might be marshy, it might be filled with giant insects itself. It may even be full of water, like you're out of the swamp into this lake that is the crater. And then in that case, I usually play that the hole is wet or partially flooded, but if you really, really want to put your players to additional challenge, you could easily just say, okay, so this entire crater is now a stagnant lake, and then the sinkhole, the hole itself, is entirely flooded. So you could make if you wanted to go that extra mile and really piss your players off, you can say, okay, this entire dungeon is underwater. Nobody likes an underwater dungeon. So that's really the first barrier to entry, is once they find the thing, they hit that first barrier to entry, which is getting down into the hole itself. Because it's not usually a constructed area, and because the nature of a sinkhole means that entry hole is going to be at the top of a cavern, the characters either have to fly down into the sinkhole somehow or rappel down with ropes or whatever. The interior, as I said, is usually a large cavern, sometimes with tunnels running through the walls, and it's usually dominated in the middle by some sort of hive, which means that if they drop down, they'll be on the top of the hive, which may require, it's going to keep them from going straight down, and it may require a lot of climbing around the outside of the hive as well if they want to go through it. And sometimes, I have like big stringing supports that run to the sides of the cavern, and so you can actually combine like this hive with like these support structures leading out to these tunnels that kind of wind down. So even though the overall shape of the dungeon is relatively straightforward, you can actually make it very labyrinthine if your players don't have the access to fly or things like that, or they don't want to take shortcuts down, they haven't brought a lot of rope with them, then just winding their way down, taking these ramps down to side tunnels, coming around and taking another strand down to the next level, that can actually add a lot of complexity to the overall layout, even though it's a relatively simple thing. It does add quite a bit of a slog to it if you do it that way, and it's actually very useful, because if you do it that way, you can add all of these giant insects in as both planned encounters and random encounters, and they're probably going to have to fight their way down. Even if they climb along the outside, they may be exposed to more threats, because let's face it, a lot of these insects might be flying, so they could be trying to climb down the outside of the hive, skipping all these side tunnels and such, and have to battle bugs that are like wasps and stuff that are buzzing them as they're climbing along the outside, and that in itself can be a big risk. However, it's not only giant insects that are in the hive, because these wet, dark confines are the prime sort of spot to put plenty of oozes, slimes, molds, and such. Whether they be creatures or hazards, you can pack these things in there So even though there's a few ways down through the hole, the party is going to be facing all of these really unpleasant vermin and oozes. And even you can even put these side tunnels that lead into smaller caves, and you can put similar hazards in those caves. Like you could put like slime covered walls in there, and that's like green slime or something similar, or yellow mold or something in there that's growing in these side caverns, just to give them more unpleasant things to face on the way down. Now, I don't usually put straight up traps in the hole. Traps require somebody attempting to do it. If I do put a trap or two in the hole, it's usually something that an animal would use, like like a hatch or something where a bug may be nesting in there. But I don't use actual straight up dungeon traps. But as I said, I do use hazards. You can make steep, slick passages that make combat difficult, so the bugs may be used to moving through these passages, but they could provide a slip or a fall chance to the adventurers. You could have some side corridors that are knee-deep or greater in standing water. As I said above, you can put slimes and such in there. You can put rooms or chambers with flammable residue or intoxicating or hallucinatory fumes in there. So they may go in there into one passage. And in addition to the giant bugs, they've got these mushrooms that have, that either are from the books or have odd hallucinatory effects in them. It's basically stuff that just adds to the challenge of fighting the actual inhabitants of the hive. And it makes for very interesting and varied combats all the way around. At least for somebody that's used to just fighting the standard humanoid type stuff. Now, the majority of the layout to this point varies from version to version, as I've said, although I need to qualify that, not necessarily the layout, but the content. Like, I'll have usually one or two maps that I kind of expand upon between each version, but a lot of times I'll actually just switch the room contents out. But as I said, it's mostly relatively simple in overall form. It's just the linkages that make it complex. Mostly sloping, winding tunnels and ramps leading gradually down to the bottom. That's just about the overall thing. As I said, for more complexity, I usually had two versions. One allowed the party to enter the nest itself, and then the other version that added the more complexity was not only allowing them to enter the nest itself, but also including the aforementioned temple at the bottom. In both instances, both forms of this, it allowed for a slightly more typical dungeon crawl style setting within the overall mess that is the hole. Generally, I placed the end goal inside of the nest if there was only the nest, or inside of the temple if the temple was there as well as the nest. One benefit of using the temple design was that I was also able to include, once they got to the temple, various undead. Yes, it's kind of an overdone thing, but they synergize very well with the rest of the theme of this dungeon, the thing that made it very, very unpleasant indeed. Because aside from being a difficult place to get to, aside from having cramped, slick, dangerous tunnels with difficult terrain, the main theme that held the entire dungeon together, besides, just being bugs and such, between the mold, the oozes, the bugs, etc., is that it's all about stacking the status effects and debuffs. I didn't have to make any one fight challenging. In fact, the party could be relatively over-leveled compared to the challenge of the things within and start out just blowing through stuff. But eventually, by the time they've traveled there, by the time they've made their way through the nest and the tunnels, by the time they've made their way to the bottom of the hole, by the time they've started into the temple, things would begin to wear on them because you're looking at exhaustion. You're looking at maybe the first signs of diseases they contracted on the way down. You're looking at poisonous stings and bites. You're looking at damage to their gear from various oozes and slimes. You're looking at ability drain from molds and such. You're looking at various odd things from the fungi that they encountered. If they encountered hallucinogenic fungi, they may still be suffering from those effects. And then you get down to the undead, and then the undead start draining whatever vitality they have, depending on the addition that it is, whatever the undead do, and so on and so forth. So the swarm nature of it means that there's very few opportunities for them to rest and get this stuff taken care of, because they're in the middle of a nest. They're in the middle of an active bug nest. So if they try to do anything, they're going to need to retreat up to the top and start it all over again. So when they finally do reach their goal, the target of their quest may be laying before them. They've been worn down, their abilities are probably not at full value, many of them are probably sick to poisons or disease, some of them may be hallucinating out of their minds, their gear is tattered and so forth. So at that point, even a moderately challenging creature, one that they could normally just steamroller over, is going to be punching well above its weight class. They may have to actually have this epic battle with something that, before they came into the hole, they would have not even thought about. But now it's there, and now they're in the state they're in. Oh, wow, suddenly it's a real challenge. It's a really fearsome guardian. And if they live, which I've had, as I said, I've had a couple different parties in different editions go down there, and they usually get out. But after they beat that guardian, they usually have to get back out, which means going all the way back up and out into the swamps above, and possibly then to civilization before they can really start getting cured up. And that means that they're going to not only face the slog back up, but a lot of the terrain that they came down on is way easier to come down from than it is to get back up. So that trek, even though they may have already cleared most of the really tough encounters, just the remnants of the swarm and the overall terrain itself might be enough to wear them down further. And then the other thing to consider, if you've been listening to how unpleasant this all is, the other thing to consider is that a lot of the various insects, oozes, and even the certain undead that they may be facing are all creatures with limited to no loot. So they're the reward for this hellacious slog is probably going to be just that one treasure that they came for. Oh sure, some bugs may have components they may take, and a resourceful party will make use of that. But if they're used to just grabbing coins from bodies, none of the stuff in here has that kind of thing. Now, admittedly, when I use the hole in my games, that treasure was really outstanding. It was like a holy avenger or something that could be used to forge something similar. The important part about the whole design of the hole is that whenever I've included it in my campaigns, number one has been completely optional. If the party goes there, it's because they find that one item within it really tempting. Number two, it's completely transparent. Well, not completely, but I tend to be much more free about information regarding the nature of the hole than I am with other dungeons that I design. Before they go in there, because it's a relatively simple design, simple background, before they go in there, the party knows what they're getting into. They may not know the exact layout, they may not know the exact nature of the insects and such within, but they know it's a disgusting hole in a swamp full of bugs. So they can plan accordingly. And it gives the party plenty of time to sit back and think, hey, do we really want to go in there for this one item? As much as I've said that it's a miserable dungeon to run through, as I said before, the few times where I decided to go ahead, where my players have decided to actually go for it, I've had more of them heard about this place, heard about what's in it, and decided they didn't want to handle it. But the few times where they decided to go for it, we all had a fair amount of fun. As the DM, I had fun. As the players, they had fun. But as I said, they wouldn't want to repeat it because it's an investment of time and it's actually an investment of a lot of their characters' resources with very little return except for that one item. So they usually said they don't want to repeat it, but they did have fun. It's definitely a concept that requires some preparation from the party's perspective, and this is where you're going to find which parties prepare and which parties just go on in. And that's really the first test of skill right there. So anyway, I just thought I'd let you know a little bit about that. I may do more of these, a few more of these on various dungeons that I've designed, that I've used over and over again in some campaigns. Hell, I may make some of them available online. I don't know. Let me know if you'd like to see some of these dungeons prepared for like 5th edition or whatever. For now, I'll go ahead and wrap it up here. This has been the RPG Crawler with RPG Storytime, the whole. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you've got feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content. If you'd like to help support my channel, please check out my Patreon at patreon.com/rpgcrawler. Until next time, take care and goodbye.